Welcome everyone who's trickling in right now. We're going to get started in about a minute. This is great. We got a good turnout today. We also have someone from Hampstead, Maryland. Hello. Formerly Baltimore. Wonderful. Okay. All right. So welcome everyone to our Friday Virtual Histories program. My name is Molly Ricks and I'm with Baltimore Heritage. In 2020, Baltimore Heritage and Baltimore Architecture Foundation partnered to host these virtual histories every other Friday. First, thank you to everyone who donated to be with us here today. Your support enables us to do more of these talks, so we're very grateful. And just a few announcements before we get started. Please join us next Wednesday for the first lecture in the 2022 AIA BAF lecture series. The series will explore current trends and changes in local and international work in the design industry as we look to our post-pandemic future. So again, that's next Wednesday. And then in 2 weeks, we will be joined by Dr. Isaac Schern of the Laurel Cemetery Memorial Project. This burial ground was incorporated in 1852 as Baltimore's first non-denominational cemetery for African Americans. Today, it is the site of the Bel Air Edison Crossing Shopping Center. However, many current patrons and nearby residents have no knowledge of the site's former purpose and significance. You can learn about why on April 1st. And now for today's presentation. Dr. Melissa Blair is a history professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and studies the history of architecture, landscapes, and material culture. Prior to joining the Department of History, she worked for more than 15 years as an architectural historian and historic preservationist for a variety of public, private, and nonprofit organizations. She is the co-author with Richard Striner of the book Washington and Baltimore Art Deco, A Design History of Neighboring. And that's the topic of today's presentation. And on a personal note, Dr. Blair is my former professor, and I'm delighted she is here. So if you have any questions while she is talking, please add them to the chat or the question and answer box, and we will have a question and answer portion at the end. And with that, I'll say thank you and take it away, Dr. Blair.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Whoops. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Excellent. Let me share my screen. It might take a minute. Here we go. And whoops. All right, so you can see my title slide. Okay. Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to be a part of this amazing virtual histories series. I was just talking with Molly before we got started and saying, you know, this is one of those silver linings of our pandemic experience is that we now have this incredible repository of recorded lectures on all sorts of interesting facets of Baltimore's history, along with the 5-minute series that Baltimore Heritage hosts, which is just really truly spectacular. So I am primarily a historian of 18th and 19th century agricultural buildings and landscapes. But in 2008, I had the good fortune to be asked to be a part of a book project on Art Deco architecture in Washington and Baltimore. Johns Hopkins University Press had approached my co-author Richard Striner about updating his book, Washington Deco, published in the 80s by Smithsonian. Editor Bob Brugger thought it would be interesting to do a two-city study to gain a more regional view of this design style. Our work built on another Deco book published in the 80s, Sherry Cucciela's Baltimore Deco. And I invite you, you should check out both of those earlier studies because they're fantastic. It was a true privilege to work with Rick, Professor Emeritus of History at Washington College, past president of the Art Deco Society of DC, and an incredible preservation advocate who has played a major role in saving key Deco buildings in DC and beyond. I will briefly allude to a few of the comparisons and contrasts we found in the two cities, but this talk will focus on how the international design movement found its way into Baltimore in the 20s and 30s. We'll glance at some of the city's well-known Deco buildings, but I hope to highlight some of the lesser known examples as well. And right now I'm calling this an architecture of optimism, thinking about, sort of in our own time, what it was like for folks to emerge from global war, and then not all that later to experience massive economic collapse, and then in the midst of all that, to be building these exuberant, fantastic buildings. And so it's just something I've been pondering lately. I suspect that many of you on this Zoom are well familiar with Art Deco, but what is it? The easiest answer is you know it when you see it, right? It emerged from the 1925 Paris Exposition of the Decorative and Industrial Arts, decorative, thus the Deco, but that term wasn't coined until the 1960s by architectural historians. And those architectural historians over the years have bickered about its range. But Rick and I worried less about parsing architecture into separate styles, but instead looked at a broad middle range of design that mediated between high art modernism and traditionalism in the interwar years. So first, just a few words on DC's Deco and its influence. As many of you know, the history of DC, Washington was really kind of an urban and civic backwater at the turn of the 20th century, right? Local industries were small in comparison with other major US cities. And so as the 20th century dawned, there was good reason to augment the stature of Washington. Public architecture was a handy and symbolic way to start. And the Macmillan Plan set a blueprint for an ambitious building program in the federal core. Though the Macmillan Plan launched at the turn of the century, things really, I would say, got going by the mid-1920s. The now iconic buildings, such as the Lincoln Memorial, the many public buildings, including those in the Federal Triangle, that classical colonnaded enclave containing, among other great Washington landmarks, the National Archives building, designed by John Russell Pope. Baltimoreans are probably familiar with Pope, and we associate him most closely with our Baltimore Museum of Art. Now, obviously, the Great Depression had a major impact on building efforts in DC, but the more serious effects of the 1929 stock market crash took some time to materialize. Thus, in 1930, Washingtonians could sense that the coarser aspects of the 20s were yielding to a serious-minded and, frankly, elegant new society. The elegance seemed to be reflected in buildings like the Shoreham Hotel, designed by Joseph Abel and completed in 1930. That building had a fantastic Art Deco lounge. A Deco lounge would also be added to the older Carlton Hotel in 1934. And we can imagine, sort of FDR's brain trusters meeting and hobnobbing at these places as they figured out a route forward for the country. So those early traces of Art Deco sort of have been filtering into Washington, where they steadily infiltrated the classicism of the Macmillan Commission legacy. And I'll pause, I don't know how noisy it is, but there's a dump truck outside my window. So I'll keep speaking loudly and hopefully you can all hear me just fine. The federal response to the Great Depression transformed the built environment, of course, across the country in the New Deal era, but acutely so in DC, and Baltimore benefited from some of that proximity. So from the desks of the brain trusters came a welter of alphabet agencies chartered to administer relief and promote rebuilding. Perhaps most important of all for American architecture, the PWA, or Public Works Administration. But let's head up northeast to Baltimore. Fueled by a robust manufacturing sector, the city became fertile ground for a wide-ranging architecture in the interwar period. The port city of Baltimore contrasted dramatically with nearby Washington. So while the nation's capital had been a rather sleepy place in the late 19th century, Baltimore was booming. its commercial and manufacturing operations, its shipping lines, its smokestack industries gave it economic vitality. And by the 1920s, the city rose to third place among American exporting cities, and more than 100 new factories appeared there. The city itself grew quickly in the 1920s, tripling in geographic size after the Maryland State Legislature passed an Annexation Act in 1918. And so the city's civic boosters were exultant and visionary. They publicized visions of a futuristic city whose skyscrapers reached to the heavens. And a little portion of their vision actually did come to fruition. But overall, the scope of Baltimore's physical development during the 20s was impressive. We have companies like SK Meats, their 1919 factory in East Baltimore, Domino Sugars, which is certainly iconic to this day, 1922 factory in Locust Point. These companies built looming, utilitarian, steel-framed and reinforced concrete structures. And they're important, well, one, because they provided so many jobs and really got our city going, but also architecturally, they inspired the leaders of European modernism, right? So this is an example where Americans' industrial architecture is having an influence on the most cutting edge design trends in Europe. We got Lever Brothers, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, McCormick Spice, Western Electric, all building large plants. And so don't overlook Baltimore's industrial buildings of the 1920s. Another 1920s aspect of Baltimore life was, it was famous as a wet town, a place where people got away with resistance to prohibition. State and local police did basically nothing to assist the federal prohibition agents sent from DC. Baltimore was definitely a city center for illicit alcohol consumption. But so following the repeal of the 18th Amendment in 1933, Baltimore's love of drink manifested itself in the opening and in many cases reopening of numerous corner bars in the older neighborhoods around the harbor. And many of these establishments took that 1930s revitalization to modernize their street level facades with deco materials, including multicolored bricks, glass block, shiny steel doors, and D-shaped windows. So the next time you're sauntering around Fells Point and other harbor neighborhoods, keep your eye out for these distinctive, I would say, deco era bars. Back to the 20s for a moment. Like Washington, Baltimore was influenced by the turn of the century city beautiful idea of civic uplift through classicism. The Macmillan plan had its counterpart in the plans put forth by Baltimore's Municipal Arts Society, founded in 1899. Among the new classical monuments created in Baltimore during the 20s were the War Memorial and War Memorial Plaza, 1925 to 27, designed by Lawrence Howe Fowler, the Able Woman Municipal Building of 1928, designed by William H. Emery Jr., and the new Baltimore Museum of Art of 1929, designed by John Russell Pope. Civic leaders and the designers they hired employed classical compositions, yet these buildings were designed for very contemporary needs. They were products of their time. And again, if you look closely, you will see that they're enlivened with modernism and deco features in many cases. Edmond Amatisse, Italian-born New Deal era sculptor from New York, created the magnificent sculptures out in front of the War Memorial Building. These are actually not ordinary horses, but fantastic aquatic creatures resting on a base of undulating waves, which you can see here really well in this boating photograph. Their forelegs and tails sprout webbed fins, and their rigid crop manes are carved with radial bands of wavy lines, evocative of sunbursts. All Art Deco motifs. Just as a random side note, in a class I had just a few years ago, I had somehow I brought up this photo and a student said, "Oh my God, that's my great grandfather." And she said the family still owned his home and studio in Orlando, and it was filled with his tools, sketches, and all of this stuff. And she spearheaded an effort to make sure the family worked with the Orlando Museum of Art to make sure all of that good stuff was preserved and properly archived. But please, I'm sure many of you pass on Gay Street, you pass these horses all the time, and you probably love them, but get out and look very closely to see these fantastic Art Deco sculptures. Again, sort of I would say probably the most famous of our Deco era buildings. Art Deco proper really filters into Baltimore during the late 20s. The Baltimore Trust Company building of 1929, designed by two firms, Taylor and Fisher and Smith and May, is a 34-story skyscraper with setback terraces. Enoch Pratt has a fantastic collection of the entire sequence of construction of this building. And I'm just showing you the last image, also taken from the same location, showing how that this magnificent skyscraper came into being. Another view that we included in the book that shows in the foreground the Lord Baltimore Hotel of 1928 by William Lee Stoddard. I think it gets outshined by the Baltimore Trust Company building, but I hope that you pay attention to it. I really think that both reflect some of that synthesis of Deco with classicism that we see in both DC and Baltimore. Another iconic Deco building in Baltimore, the elegant Hutzler Brothers department store building. And many of you know that this is not the original Hutzlers, but an expansion. And think what it meant to undertake such a major expansion of a department store in 1931. Designed by James R. Edmonds Jr., featuring this tower with superb entrance level Deco ornamentation. So, you know, overt large-scale expressions of Art Deco are far fewer in number in Baltimore than the hundreds of more modest Deco-inspired buildings. And I think we see that most frequently in commercial structures around the city. Just one example, McCrory's 5 and 10 on West Lexington. The original part of this 5 and 10 was on Howard Street, and in September 1930, they sort of expanded in an L around to West Lexington. And the glazed terracotta tiles are a really fine expression of ornate Deco zigzag mode. And they're just as, the colors are just as bold as when they were initially laid. So Baltimore suffered just as much as other American cities of comparable size in the Great Depression. And the New Deal did bring a significant amount of economic relief to the city, especially through job creation projects such as the PWA and the WPA. The agency spent $100 million in the state from 1934 to 1937. And with PWA funding, Baltimore's Bureau of Water Supply accelerated a 10-year construction program and completed it in 4 years. So talk about economic stimulus, right? The Bureau's massive steel tank reservoir on Melvin Avenue in Catonsville embodied the bold optimism of PWA architecture. And so if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to drive over to Melvin Avenue and peek through the fence at this mammoth and just incredible piece of infrastructure, and think about what we want to do in our own time with stimulus bills and a renewed interest in infrastructure. But you got to remember, Baltimore was a pretty conservative place politically in the New Deal era. The mayor, Howard Jackson, he was very hostile to the New Deal. He resisted a lot of the efforts of the PWA, particularly around public housing, which he and many others viewed as a threat to private sector real estate and construction industries. So it's only at the tail end, right on the eve of World War II, that the city embraces federally supported public housing. So Latrobe Homes is the third PWA sponsored housing project in the city. And so the Baltimore Housing Authority had a lot more control, right? This is when local control was stronger than in those initial years of federal public housing building. And so the design of Latrobe Homes, I think, reflects both a subtle influence of the international style and also the era's fad for streamlining. Again, this might be something that people don't initially think of when they think of Art Deco, but I definitely feel that it fits within this time period and some of the forward-thinking, forward-looking architecture that emerged. But least I get too excited. We have to remember the social history of places like Latrobe Homes. Its designers and planners were very forthright in the news and in other places that these were apartments developed for white residents, and they were very deliberately trying to protect property values in the white neighborhoods to the north. So that sort of baked in segregation that we've all been sort of studying and learning more and more about in our city is a part of the story of Latrobe Homes. These new complexes are altering the city socially as well as visually. This was featured in a 5-minute history by Baltimore Heritage. So I just, what I'm going to do with my remaining time is I'm going to just share basically a smattering of buildings we highlight in the book. My point is to show how Deco filters into industrial, residential, commercial, transportation, education, even religious buildings, and to see it spreading out across the city. So, of course, in the 30s, Baltimore's industrial growth is slowed, but it doesn't stop. And the projects are sort of on a lesser scale than those factories we saw emerging in the 20s. But light manufacturers construct modest factories that incorporate those clean lines of American industrial architecture and include Deco flourishes. So along with the Coca-Cola bottling company, you want to check out the other industrial buildings clustered around Kirk Avenue and 25th Street in Northeast Baltimore. Again, it's often a very subtle, it might just be a Deco design around a doorway, but this speaks to some of the trends that were going on in industrial buildings during this time. We don't have nearly the number of residential Deco buildings that DC has, and a large part of that is because the federal city was such a hub for white collar workers, and there was an explosion of garden apartments all around Northern Virginia and Northwest DC. DC embraced apartment buildings on a much grander scale than our city did, but nevertheless, if you look for it, you will find residential architecture that reflects the modernism and Deco trends of the era. I love the Sam Ester Parkway apartments built in 1939, designed by Hal Miller. You can still see it there on Park Heights Avenue, and that Sam Ester is the first names of the developer and his wife, Sam and Esther. So that's just kind of a cute and fun fact about this, very, very modern looking complex, absolutely with the stainless steel and the glass block and the sort of streamlined look to it. Look even harder in neighborhoods like West Arlington, and you may capture a house like this. And this is the Schumer House from 1936. It's still standing, or at least it was when I went out and surveyed it in the teens. Again, it doesn't quite fit with its neighborhoods. It's surrounded by colonial revivals and bungalows. And so you realize that the builders and first residents were very forward thinking in their choices. Maybe a little bit more familiar to folks because of its highly visible and close by Hopkins Homewood campus is the House of Tomorrow on St. Paul Street, designed by John Ayers in 1937. And again, this is a house that I think captures well Baltimore's sort of, we're flirting with modernism, but we're rooted in our classicism. And the result, I think, is quite successful and unique. More commercial buildings, of course, there's who doesn't love this one, Kresge store, that reflects that streamlining very well, built in 1937. And then also very beloved, of course, our Senator Theater. The Senator Theater's architect, John J. Zink, is one of the connections, the points of comparison between the two cities that emerge. Zink built so many theaters in both cities. And just a note that Baltimore's survival rate has been better than DC, even though so they had some bigger theaters and arguably grander. Our zinc theaters held on a little bit better. And of course, this has been in the preservation news lately, right? The Ambassador Theater out there on Liberty Heights is another John J. Zink's design, this one of 1935, and hopefully we'll see that beautiful neon, streamlined neon glowing again on Liberty Heights in the not too distant future. Back to the Mount Vernon neighborhood, the Chanticleer Lounge, which I'm sorry, I might not get this right. I think it's a CVS or a Rite Aid or something, right there in the heart of Mount Vernon. But I do like to see it in its original form with the fantastic embellishment on the top. And you can really get a sense of just how streamlined and modern this cocktail lounge was. This one was designed by John Poe Tyler. Cold Spring Lane, sort of in north central Baltimore. This is a dated picture because the restaurant name is Local Hombre, which now it's Namaste, which is a great restaurant you should go to if you're back out going to restaurants. I love this pairing of the Alonzo's Bar, which is on the right-hand side, because you get to see this nice stainless steel and glass block facade right beside a really interesting building material that is another point of connection between Baltimore and DC. So I'm just going to flip ahead 1 second to a house in DC, the Polychrome House number 1 of 1934. And this house uses this totally unique technology developed by John Joseph Early, which, he created these concrete panels that were emblazoned with patterns formed out of little bits of colored stone. And so to the best of my knowledge, somebody needs to correct me if I'm wrong, but here we have Early's concrete panels, our Baltimore example, and there are more in the suburbs of DC than we have. But again, those colors are just as vibrant as the day when they were put up. Transportation, we have the Streamlined Greyhound Terminal of 1941, designed by William Arrowsmith. And this building follows right on the heels of Washington's Greyhound Terminal, or Super Terminal, also designed by Arrowsmith. And that was one of the buildings that my co-author, Richard Striner, fought very, very hard to preserve. And there's a whole story, an amazing preservation story about saving the Greyhound Terminal in DC that I hope you all can learn about someday. It wasn't a 100% success, but there was a compromise, and we do have the front part of that building preserved to this day. And of course, Maryland history is a great steward of our Greyhound terminal here in Baltimore. Educational buildings, I think that the Baltimore Board of Education was very forward thinking during the 30s. There are quite a number of examples of schools built during this time. I'm just going to highlight one, Garrison Junior High. This one, when you first glance at it, you're sort of like, oh, that's collegiate Gothic. Not sure that's really Deco-y, but look in a little closer and you will see that it is just completely, the programmatic design is very much, you've got that tower with sort of a ziggurat form, and just all throughout this incredible building, which is still standing. We see the Board of Education, embracing the new and the modern, while again, sort of honing on, holding to a bit of a more traditional architectural styles as well. And finally, lastly, I will share with you one religious example, and some people may want to debate me on this, and I welcome it, but I consider Cathedral Mary Our Queen part of Baltimore's Art Deco heritage. This is a 1950s building, but many of you may know its story, which begins all the way back in the Great Fire of 1904, and the planning for this structure happened over many, many years. And so if you haven't had a chance to look around the outside and through it, this is a very accessible building that you can go in many, many times, and you will see there is a deco sort of decorative program in all of the many sculptures and stained glass, and even the lighting fixtures scream deco. So sort of a late, probably one of our latest deco examples in the city, completed in 1959 and designed by Eugene Kennedy for the Catholic Diocese. So I'm going to just conclude now. So Washington architecture in the 20s and 30s, I think we could argue in many ways it was cutting edge. And this is largely due to the influence of an innovative federal government. So DC was at the forefront of this blend of classicism and deco that many now refer to as Greco-Deco. And you can see examples of it around the country. And when you do, you may be looking at a PWA building. Baltimore's architecture in the 20s and 30s really was more in line with national patterns, and fueled by a robust manufacturing sector. The city became fertile ground for a really wide-ranging architecture, and designers and builders mixed freely the prevailing trends of the day. I will say that our city's architecture during this period definitely leans towards the traditional. We have far more colonial revival buildings than we do deco buildings, of course, especially in our residential neighborhoods. But nevertheless, I think Baltimore is still a very important representation of how America's major industrial cities embraced these trends during the interwar years. And so, of course, we don't have anything on the level of glamour and flamboyancy that you find in New York, Miami, LA, but don't count out Baltimore's Art Deco. So from our major structures like the Baltimore Trust Company building, but also more subtly in apartment houses, shops, civic buildings, it really gives us a sense of how this very powerful, innovative, very popular, and I would say optimistic design style made its way into some pretty ordinary regular places. Thanks so much. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blair. And that was wonderful. And we have a lot of great questions here. So I'm going to, I'm going to go kind of work my way backwards. Someone said, did Melissa say what is on the cover of her book?
Oh, yeah, this is from the Library of Congress, the Jefferson building. It's right above an elevator there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. DC's first, it's Washington and Baltimore Deco, and they get the cover, and that's fair.
Okay, this time. So someone said there are great women deco architects on the West Coast. Are there any on the East Coast or elsewhere?
I'm scared to say no, but women architects did not figure prominently in our study.
Okay, good to know. Someone said, are the post office facilities in Baltimore in your book? So many Art Deco influences there.
Again, forgive me, it's been quite a while since I worked on this project, and I've been back with my rural buildings, but I don't think we highlighted any post offices, no.
Okay.
There's more work to do.
Maybe we need a book just on the post offices.
Oh, believe me, somebody could do. I missed a lot, you guys. I missed some key gas stations. I missed quite a bit, you guys. There's more work to do.
So someone asked, what would you say makes Art Deco optimistic?
Again, I think that's my reflection right now in 2022, right? That I'm just more cognizant of what it would have been like to live during this time period, and the people who were really creating a lot of this architecture, also the users, of course, really experienced a lot of intense, dramatic global events as we are now. And so that just kind of brought to me this sense of like, when I look at these buildings, they're just, they're forward looking, right? They really are forward looking, and they're innovative, and they're, even though in DC and Baltimore, they are kind of holding close to classical motifs, they're just doing it in such a new and invigorated way. And I just think it seems to me like there were a lot of people that made some bold choices, and in times that, we think of the glamorous 20s, but honestly, people lived through rough stuff, just like we are. And they embraced innovation and just exuberance, I think. And maybe that was a reaction to the times they were living in.
Wonderful. What was the name of the unique building material that's concrete? I think this is the slabs that you were talking about.
The polychrome panels. Yeah, polychrome concrete panels. John Joseph Early.
John Joseph Early.
Yep.
Okay. So this is very specific, but it's an interesting. Can you confirm urban deco lore of Dashiell Hammett's Maltese falcon that was inspired by his viewing of the deco birds on the Baltimore Social Security building facade?
I do not know that. Again, so much to learn. Whoa. Okay.
Yeah, I don't either. And actually, it's funny because I always thought Dashiell Hammett was inspired by the bronze sort of eagle falcon looking things on the Continental Trust building. So multiple lore here that we'll have to look into.
To be done.
Yeah, definitely. So there, yeah, who knows? Let's see.
Somebody knows.
Well, I have a question that I'll ask, and this is kind of I think maybe a whole another presentation could be on this, but is it, I look at the buildings that are built today, the schools, the factories, all these sort of things, and they're, boring and I'm just wondering, they're boring and they don't use interesting materials and that sort of thing. Is it just a money thing? Like, why don't we have architectural trends like these beautiful Art Deco buildings?
Or can we just not see it yet? I'm not a person that can speak eloquently at all about contemporary design. It's not what I know. It's not what I think, but I do pause every time I sort of have that feeling like you're having, Molly, because I have it all the time, like blah, or like what, where is the pizzazz that, people in, the Board of Education built these incredible buildings. Like, why aren't we doing that? And I think maybe I just don't have perspective, to be honest. Maybe. And maybe it's what you're suggesting as well. A lack of inspiration and above all, a lack of funds, right? We don't want to allot money for design, right? We want to get, squeeze the most out of our funds and of our public funds, and design is so often considered a superfluous, or right, like and I know there's probably many people here on the Zoom that can say a big amen to like the importance of paying for good design.
And someone also just made a good point that, building things more quickly and safety and that sort of things, and accessibility, which I know are important as well.
Yeah.
So these are all good thoughts. And you're right. Maybe I'll look back 50 years and say, what was I thinking?
Those are so cool. Look at those 2020 buildings, right?
Right. Good way of looking at that.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about at the 140 mark, so I think we'll stop there. And again, this will be recorded. I apologize to those who were having some audio issues at the beginning. And I'll just say thank you again, Dr. Melissa Blair, for coming out and sharing with us.
Thanks, everybody, for hearing me out. And please go and explore Baltimore's Deco.
Wonderful. Thanks.